The silence of the Dakota Plains was a living thing, a heavy shroud that Alara had learned to fear. It was the silence that had swallowed her husband, Elias, 3 weeks earlier, leaving her alone with their newborn son, Thomas. But that empty silence, however lonely, was a mercy compared to the sound that replaced it. It began as a scratch on the night of October 12th, then a low, guttural cough she mistook for the wind. The next morning she saw the footprints, pressed deep into the mud near the water pump, too large for a coyote, wrong for a wolf. They were round, heavy, and fresh. She ran back inside, rifle in hand, heart pounding with terror. The creature wasn't just passing through. The silence outside had changed. It had become the silence of a hunter, and he knew she wasn't alone. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching this story from. I'd love to know how far these exciting stories are reaching. And if you've ever experienced an inexplicable situation, share it with us. Before the hunter, there was the silence. It had been 23 days since Alara had last heard her husband's voice. 23 days since Elias had hitched the mule to the rickety wagon. His face, a mixture of foolish optimism and gnawing worry, and promised to be back from the land office in Fort Laramie in 10 days. 12 at the most, he'd said, kissing her on the forehead, his beard scratching her skin. You and the boy just keep the fire lit, Alara. I'll be back with the deed. Now the fire was out. The little pile of wood he'd chopped was long gone, and the new pile she had desperately hacked at herself was dwindling, each piece a pathetic fraction of his powerful, clean-splitting strokes. Alara stood in the center of the one-room sawed cabin. It was generous to call it a room. It was a box dug 3 feet into the hard Dakota earth, with walls of stacked prairie turf that smelled of grass and decay. It was their home, or she feared it was her tomb. The air inside was cold, thick with the smell of old smoke, sour milk, and the ever-present dust that sifted down from the sod and plank roof. She looked at his chair, a simple 3-legged stool he had carved from a cottonwood stump. His whittling knife was still on the small shelf above it, next to his half-empty tin of tobacco. These relics were the ghosts in the room. They were the promises that had not been kept. Loneliness, she had learned, was not a feeling. It was an environment. It was the vast, unbroken prairie that pressed in on all 4 sides, a sea of brown, rustling grass that offered no comfort, no landmarks, and no mercy. The wind, that damnable, constant wind, was the only voice she heard. It whined at the corners of the cabin, it tugged at the greased paper window, and it carried away the sound of her own voice when she called for him. She had stopped calling his name 5 days ago. The sound of it, unanswered, was too much to bear. In the corner, a small whimper broke the stillness. Her son, Thomas. At 2 months old, he was a small, fragile flame against the crushing dark. He was all she had left of Elias. He was all that kept her tethered to the world. She moved to the cradle, another of Elias's half-finished projects, and gently lifted the boy. He was light, too light. Her milk was thinning, her own body starved and stressed. "Hush, little one," she whispered, her voice rough. "Hush now." Thomas's cries were the only thing that marked the passage of time. The sun rose and set in the same empty sky. The chores were the same: fetch water from the creek, check the pitiful garden, rebar the door against what? Coyotes. The unknown. She had come here to this desolate patch of land to build a life. She had fled the cholera-ridden, crowded tenements of St. Louis, where her parents and sister had been buried in the same week. She had traded one kind of death for another. "He's just delayed, Alara," she'd told herself on the 11th day. "A broken wheel. He's waiting out a storm," she'd said on the 14th. "He's on his way," she'd whispered on the 20th, knowing it was a lie. Elias was gone. The prairie had taken him. The silence had swallowed him whole. Now she was the only thing standing between her son and that same devouring emptiness. She was a settler, a homesteader, a widow. She was, she realized, completely and utterly alone. But she was wrong. The silence was about to break, and the one thing she had feared more than anything, being alone, was about to be replaced by a terror far, far worse. She was being watched. It began on the morning of the 24th day. It was a cold, sharp morning, the kind that promised an early frost. Ilara woke from a fitful sleep, the cabin air colder than usual. Thomas was blessedly, deeply asleep, a rare reprieve. She knew she had to use the quiet. She needed water. She grabbed the heavy wooden yoke Elias had built, the 2 tin buckets attached by rope, and unbarred the heavy plank door. The hinges groaned in protest. She stepped out onto the cold, damp earth, her breath a cloud in the air. The creek was a 50-yard walk down a slight incline. She scanned the horizon. Nothing, just the endless swaying grass, brown and dead. She made her way to the small hand pump Elias had managed to rig just 20 feet from the cabin door, a backup for when the creek was low. The ground around it was always muddy. She placed her buckets and reached for the iron handle, and she froze. There, pressed perfectly into the dark, damp mud, was a print. Her mind refused to process it at first. It was too large for a coyote, the wrong shape for a wolf, lacking the claw marks she'd been taught to look for. This was round, padded, heavy. She could see the distinct 3-lobed shape of the heel pad and the 4 clean toe marks in front of it. It was as large as her own outstretched hand. Her blood turned to ice. She had seen a track like this once before in a trapper's guide Elias had owned. Panther, cougar, mountain lion. The name didn't matter. It was a cat. A big cat. She looked around wildly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The empty prairie suddenly seemed full. The tall grass wasn't empty, it was hiding. The silence wasn't silence, it was a held breath. How close had it been? The print was fresh. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by the wind. It had been here, while she slept, 20 feet from her door, 20 feet from her child. A new sound came to her, carried on the wind. A low guttural cough. She'd heard it in the night, in that half-state between sleeping and waking, and had dismissed it as the house settling, or the wind in a hollow log. It wasn't the wind. It was a call. She abandoned the buckets and the yoke. She scrambled back inside, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift the heavy wooden bar. She dropped it into place. The solid thud was the only comfort she had. She ran to the cradle. Thomas was still sleeping, his small face peaceful. She scooped him up, pressing him to her chest, her body trembling. "Oh, God," she whispered into his thin hair. "Oh, God, no." The sound came again, closer this time. A deep scraping sound. Claws dragging across the sod of the roof. The cougar was testing the house. It knew she was inside. It knew she was not alone. The 15-day ordeal had begun. The first day was a blur of pure, adrenalized terror. Ilara did not move from the center of the room, clutching Thomas, the single-shot rifle heavy and useless across her lap. She only had 2 cartridges left for it. 2. What good were 2 shots against a shadow? But the creature did not try to break in. It was smarter than that. Day 2, the siege began in earnest. The cougar's strategy was not brute force. It was psychological. At dusk, she saw it for the first time. She'd gathered the courage to peer through a small knothole in the plank door. It was sitting at the edge of the creek 100 yards away. It was a massive female, larger than she could have imagined, its coat the same tawny brown as the dead grass. But it was thin. She could see the sharp line of its ribs even from this distance. A starving mother, perhaps. The thought brought her no comfort, only a deeper, more primal dread. It was not just a predator, it was a desperate one. It sat and watched the cabin. It wasn't hunting. It was waiting. On the 4th day, the creature brought her a gift. Ilara had left a small corn husk doll, one she'd woven for Thomas on the porch railing weeks ago, during the days she still had hope of Elias's return. In the night, she heard a scrape on the porch. When dawn broke, she peered through the knothole. The doll was gone. In its place, on the top step, was the half-eaten carcass of a rabbit, its blood a dark stain on the wood. The cougar was showing her it could get that close. that it could leave a kill or take one, that the 3 feet of wood and sod between them was a courtesy it was extending. For now, her new routine was one of a prisoner. She rationed her movements. She rationed her food, a handful of cornmeal, a sip of water. She rationed her hope. By the 7th day, the cabin had become a pressure cooker. Thomas cried constantly, his wails thin and weak. He was starving. Ilara's body, under the immense, unceasing stress, had stopped producing enough milk. The cougar, as if angered by the sound, would answer his cries with its own. It would circle the cabin, its heavy paws thudding on the earth, its low, guttural moans vibrating through the very walls. It was a duet of misery, a wail of hunger from within, and a roar of hunger from without. On the 10th day, the beast climbed onto the roof. She'd been trying to boil her last handful of dried beans, the small fire filling the cabin with smoke. Suddenly, the ceiling sifted dust. A heavy pacing thud, thud, thud walked from one end of the roof to the other. Then a terrible, heavy settling. It had laid down, directly above her. It was listening. Ilara stared up at the plank ceiling, tears of pure, animalistic terror streaming down her face. She put her hand over Thomas's mouth to silence his cries, her other hand over her own. The cougar was no longer just a jailer. It was a roommate. She was trapped. The woodpile was outside. The water was outside. The world was outside. And in that world, the monster waited. On the 13th day, her desperation boiled over. The water barrel was empty. Thomas was listless, his lips cracked. She could not let him die of thirst. She grabbed the rifle. She loaded one of the precious cartridges. "Get out!" she screamed at the door, her voice a broken thing. "Leave us alone!" She took a breath, unbarred the door, and threw it open. It was right there, not 20 feet away, crouching by the woodpile. Its yellow eyes met hers. They were not filled with malice. They were empty, empty of everything but a cold, patient hunger. It rose, tensed, and let out a scream, a sound like a woman being murdered. Ilara panicked. She raised the rifle, her hands shaking, and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt, 10 feet to the animal's left. The explosion of the gunpowder was deafening. The cougar did not flinch. It did not run. It simply watched the dirt settle. It looked back at her, and in that gaze, Ilara understood the horrifying truth. It was not afraid of her. It was not afraid of her gun. She slammed the door, barred it, and slid to the floor, the rifle clattering from her numb fingers. She had wasted a shot. She had shown her weakness. She had 1 bullet left. The 15-day ordeal was a game, and the cougar was winning. Day 14 was the day the hope died. The small bag of cornmeal, which she had made last for weeks, was gone. She scraped the last powdery remains from the burlap and mixed it with the last of the brackish water from the barrel. She fed the thin gray paste to Thomas, who barely had the strength to swallow. Ilara herself ate nothing. Her stomach had long since stopped complaining. Now, a cold, light-headed clarity was setting in. It was the detached, floating feeling of true starvation. The cougar, sensing this change, grew bolder. It no longer hid in the tall grass. It sat in the middle of the clearing, brazen as if it owned the land, which, Ilara thought, it did. It would watch the door, its head tilted, as if listening to the fading heartbeats inside. The psychological warfare had given way to a simple, brutal waiting game. The beast was no longer trying to terrify her. It was simply waiting for her to die. It was waiting for the cries to stop. It was waiting for the silence that would tell it the house was ready to be claimed. That night, Ilara did not sleep. She sat in Elias's cold, hard chair, holding her silent, listless child. She looked at the last bullet, gleaming in the moonlight that slanted through the paper window. 1 bullet. She could use it on the cougar, but she had seen it. The animal was preternaturally calm. It would not stand still. She would miss, and then what? She could use it on Thomas, and then herself. The thought came unbidden, a cold black snake slithering into her mind. A quick end to the suffering. An escape. She looked at her son's face, pale and translucent in the gloom. His small chest rose and fell, a barely perceptible motion. No, a different kind of fire lit inside her. A cold, hard anger. The prairie had taken her husband. It would not take her son. The cougar, this living, breathing symbol of all the world's merciless hunger, would not have him. This was not a game. This was a war. She would not be the hunted. She would be the hunter. Her mind, sharpened by starvation and rage, began to work. The rifle was useless. Her body was weak. She could not fight the beast. But Elias had not just been a dreamer. He had been a builder. Her eyes fell on the tools in the corner. His axe, a coil of thick rope. The heavy iron pulley he had brought from St. Louis, intended for a well he would never dig. And then she looked at the door. The door was not just a plank. It was a weapon. It was heavy, made of thick cottonwood, reinforced with iron straps. It was held in place by the heavy wooden bar which rested on two sturdy U-shaped brackets Elias had bolted into the door frame. A new thought took shape. A trap. A deadfall. The cougar was bold. It was arrogant. It believed it had won. It had been on her porch. It had looked her in the eye. She would use that arrogance against it. The 15-day ordeal had reached its apex. The turning point was not a sound, but a decision. The prey had decided to set a trap for the predator, and she would bait it with the only thing she had left. This was the 15th day, the day the game would end. Elara's movements were slow, deliberate, and fueled by a terrifying, calm resolve. She laid Thomas in his cradle and wrapped him in every blanket she had, pushing the cradle into the furthest, safest corner. Then she began to work. She took Elias's axe. With agonizing, near-silent effort, she began to chip away at the sawed wall above the doorframe. She needed a hole, just big enough to pass the rope through. It took an hour. Her arms, weak from hunger, screamed in protest. Next, the rope. She tied one end to the heavy iron pulley. She fed the other end up and through the new hole. She went outside. This was the most dangerous part. She unbarred the door and stepped onto the porch. The air was still. The sun was setting. The cougar was there at the edge of the clearing, watching. It rose to its haunches, curious at this change in the routine. "Come on," Elara whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Come and see." Ignoring the beast, she threw the rope over the main roof beam that extended 2 feet past the front wall. She looped it, secured the pulley, and let the main rope hang down directly over the doorway. She walked back inside. The cougar watched her every move. Inside, she took the heavy wooden bar from the door. She tied the rope to its center. With the last of her strength, she hauled on the rope, lifting the heavy bar 3 feet above the doorway. She tied off the other end to the iron leg of her cast-iron stove, the only thing in the cabin heavy enough to hold it. The trap was set. It was a crude deadfall triggered by hand. The door itself was the final piece. She pulled it wide open. An invitation. Now the bait. She took the blood-soaked rabbit carcass from the step and threw it into the center of the cabin. The smell of it, coppery and raw, filled the room. But that was not enough. She looked at Thomas. She unwrapped him. She took the small, soiled blanket from beneath him, the one that smelled most strongly of milk and baby. Her hands shook, and a single hot tear cut a path through the grime on her cheek. "Forgive me, Thomas," she whispered. She draped the blanket over the rabbit. She took her last bullet. She loaded the rifle. She laid it on the floor next to her. Then she hid. She crouched in the darkest corner of the cabin, behind the stove, her hand on the rope. And she waited. Darkness fell. The cabin was a black pit. The only sound was her own shallow breathing. An hour passed. 2. Then a sound. The soft pad, pad, pad of paws on the hard, packed earth of the porch. A shadow blocked the moonlight from the open doorway. The cougar was there. It stood for a long minute, silhouetted against the prairie. It sniffed the air. It smelled the blood, the milk. It smelled the weakness inside. It took one step into the cabin. Elara's heart stopped. It took another step. It was in. Its yellow eyes, accustomed to the dark, scanned the room. It saw the bait. It lowered its head. Now, Elara yanked the knot free from the stove leg. The The sound was not a roar, but a thwack and a snap. The heavy wooden bar, weighing over 60 pounds, fell 3 feet and struck the cougar across the back of its neck. The sound of vertebrae breaking was sickeningly loud. The beast collapsed, its front legs folding, its head hitting the dirt floor. It let out a single, choking gasp. Elara scrambled forward, grabbing the rifle. The cougar was not dead. It was paralyzed, its hind legs kicking, its head twisting, those yellow eyes now wide with shock and rage, finding her in the dark. It snarled, a wet, bubbling sound. She stood over it, her entire body shaking, the rifle barrel wavering. The beast was shattered, but its hatred was alive. She pressed the cold, iron ring of the muzzle directly against its skull, between the 2 burning eyes. "No," she whispered. "You don't get him." She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the tiny cabin. The flash lit the room for a single hellish second, burning the image into her mind, the beast, the blood, the fear, and then silence. A true, profound, and absolute silence. The wind had died. The crying had stopped. The hunting was over. She stood in the dark for a long time, the smell of gunpowder and blood burning her nose, before she finally allowed herself to collapse. Dawn broke, gray and unforgiving. Elara did not know when she had fallen asleep or if she had. She awoke on the cold dirt floor, her body one singular throbbing ache. The first thing she saw was the great tawny mass in the center of her home. It was just an animal now, a thing of fur and bone, its power gone. It was thin, its ribs sharp beneath its hide. It was just a starving creature driven to a desperate act. Just like her. Elara stood, her legs shaking. She went to the cradle. Thomas was alive. He was weak, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. She knew she could not stay. This cabin was not a home, it was a grave. A grave for her husband and a grave for the beast that had hunted her. She did not pack. She had nothing to pack. She took the remaining water from the pump, filling a small canteen. She took the axe. She wrapped Thomas in her thickest shawl, strapping him to her chest. She did not look at the body of the cougar as she stepped over it. She walked out of the open doorway and did not look back. She did not know where the nearest settlement was. Fort Laramie was a 10-day ride by wagon. She was on foot. She just picked a direction, east towards the rising sun, and began to walk. She walked for 2 days, fueled by nothing but the will to put one foot in front of the other. The prairie was empty. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of survival. It was a silence she had earned. On the 3rd day, a speck on the horizon grew into a wagon. It was a patrol, soldiers from the fort, searching for a settler and his wife who had been reported missing. They found a woman, but the wife they were looking for was gone. The woman they found was someone else entirely. She was gaunt, her eyes hollow, her lips cracked and bleeding. But in her eyes there was a fire that no prairie wind could extinguish. She was a survivor. She was a mother. She never spoke of the 15 days. She never told the soldiers what was in the cabin. When they asked her name, she simply said, Elara, Elara and Thomas. She had faced the wild, the hunger, and the dark, both outside her home and inside her mind. She had been hunted, and she had won. The whispers of the past are never truly gone. They linger in the rustle of the tall grass and in the foundations of the homes we build. Stories like Elara's are a testament to the iron will of those who came before us. If you were moved by this story and you want to keep these echoes from the old world alive, please subscribe to Old World Whispers. We have so many more stories to tell. Thank you for listening.